seeing life as it is, Buddhist wisdom. Most of us have spent years trying to see more clearly, more objectively, more honestly, more calmly. We have read about it, practiced it, returned to it after every time we lost it. And in all that trying, almost no one stops to ask what the seeing itself is doing. Not what we are looking at, what the looking is. Because there is something the Buddha pointed to quietly, without announcing it as a revelation, that turns this question just slightly on its side. Not enough to confuse you, just enough to make you look again. What if the looking was never neutral? Not a clean window, not an empty mirror, but a process already in motion, already shaping, already coloring, already deciding before the mind even knows it has started. If you have ever caught yourself reading a situation and realizing, seconds later, that you had read it through something older, a fear, a memory, an expectation that belonged to a different room and a different year, then you already know what this points toward. You were not seeing the moment. You were seeing your history, laid quietly over the present. And here is what makes this worth sitting with. That is not a failure. That is not a problem to fix. That is simply what the mind does, faster than awareness can follow. The question is not how to stop it. The question is whether it can be seen. Before we go further, notice whether this has happened to you recently. Not a dramatic moment, an ordinary one. A conversation, a familiar face, a room you have walked into 100 times. What were you actually seeing? And here is what changes when that question is asked honestly. Not the situation itself, the relationship to it. There is something that happens at 3 in the morning. Not because of noise, not because of pain, but because something unfinished is still moving through the mind. A conversation from earlier that day. An exchange that felt wrong in a way that is hard to name. The mind keeps returning to it, testing different versions, wondering what should have been said, what the other person really meant, whether anything can be repaired. The body is tired, the mind is awake. And somewhere underneath all the thinking, there is a tone. Not the thoughts themselves, the thing the thoughts are riding on, an unpleasant note, a kind of weight that was already there before the first specific thought arrived. The thoughts are the mind's attempt to do something about that tone, to name it, solve it, protect against it, explain it into safety. And this is exactly where practice becomes something other than a technique. Because the instruction is not to stop the thoughts, not to replace them with a mantra or turn toward the breath or tell the mind to quiet down. The instruction is simpler and more demanding than any of that. Meet what is actually here. Not the story about the conversation, the tone underneath it. Where is it in the body? What is its texture? Is it tight or hollow, moving or still? Does it have a location or does it seem to be everywhere at once? This is not analysis. It is the beginning of actual contact. Contact with what is genuinely present before the mind has added its explanation. A Vietnamese meditation master described this kind of attention as seeing and knowing things as they actually are. Not as they should be, not as they were, not as they might become, as they are right now in this body, in this moment, in this living field of what is arising. And when that kind of seeing is present, even briefly, even clumsily, something changes. The tone is still there. The unfinished situation is still unfinished, but the suffering shifts quality. It is no longer a problem demanding to be solved before morning arrives. It is something that is here, that can be felt, that arose according to conditions and will pass according to conditions. The night is the same, the body is the same, but the way experience is being met has changed. This is the teaching not as philosophy, but as something that has to happen in the dark, in the 3 in the morning moment, before it means anything at all. If this is already something you recognize, not as a new idea, but as something you have touched before without knowing what to call it, stay with that. The recognition itself is where the practice begins. Now watch what actually happens in a smaller moment. Not 3 in the morning, the middle of an ordinary day. A certain kind of conversation, not a dramatic one, not an argument. The kind that has been going on long enough that both people have stopped being careful. Someone says something. It lands. And before any decision is made about how to respond, before any thought has fully formed, the body has already responded. A slight shift in posture, a change in the quality of attention. Something in the chest that was open has quietly closed. The person speaking has not finished the sentence yet, but the verdict is already in. This is not a failure of character. It is not a sign of being closed-minded or reactive. It is simply how perception works. By the time an experience reaches awareness, the mind has already sorted it, compared it to memory, assigned it a tone, positioned the body accordingly. In the teaching of dependent origination, the Buddha mapped this chain with unusual precision, not as a philosophical claim about consciousness, as a practical map of how an ordinary moment becomes a suffering one. Imagine rewinding that conversation frame by frame. First there was contact, the words arriving, the voice, the specific way a sentence landed. Then a feeling arose, not an emotion yet, something more primitive. A bare tone, pleasant, unpleasant, or neither. The body knew before the mind named it. Then something reached toward that feeling. Away from it if it was unpleasant, toward it if it was pleasant. This reaching is what the Buddha called craving, not in the dramatic sense, but in the ordinary sense of a mind that cannot leave experience alone. And from that reaching, a world assembles itself. Story, identity, memory, imagined future. The verdict that arrived before the sentence finished. The turning point in this chain is not in the contact. It is not even in the feeling. It is in what happens in the fraction of a second between the feeling and the reaching. That fraction of a second is where everything is possible. There is probably a moment in your own life where this chain ran exactly like that, and you only recognized it afterward. If one comes to mind right now, that recognition is already the beginning of something. There is a particular misunderstanding about what seeing clearly actually means. Most people imagine it as stepping back, becoming an observer, watching the inner weather from a safe distance, calm, slightly removed, noting what arises without being touched by it. This can be genuine practice, but it can also quietly become something else. Another position, a more composed self standing behind the turbulence. The emotions over there, the reactions over there, and here, in this observer, something steadier, wiser, less disturbed. But look carefully at where the watcher comes from. It arises from contact, from feeling, from memory and the particular habits of this moment. It depends on attention, on the continued quiet sense of someone who is aware. Even the watcher is part of the field. This is not a problem to fix, it is something to see. Because when it is seen, not as a concept but as a living fact in the middle of actual experience, the spell weakens slightly. Not the feeling remains. But the authority of the story, the certainty that what is being felt is the whole truth of the situation, softens just enough that the chain does not have to complete itself in the same old way. Seeing clearly does not mean standing outside experience. It means seeing the process of experience clearly enough, while it is happening, that something shifts inside the happening itself. Here is something that can be tried, not in a meditation session, not when things are quiet and the conditions have been arranged carefully. In the next moment, something pulls at you, an irritation, a small flare of impatience, an unease you cannot quite name. Pause before you reach for it. Not to suppress it, not to explain it, just to feel it. Where is it in the body? What does it actually feel like before the story about it arrives? You are not looking for an answer. You are not trying to make it go away. You are simply making contact with what is actually present, before the interpretation, before the reaction, in that narrow window between the feeling and the reaching. This is not a technique for becoming calmer. It is the beginning of seeing the chain while it is still moving. And it takes a second, not years of practice, not a retreat. One breath turned toward what is actually here, before the mind explains it away. If that lands somewhere, come back to it, not as a method to master, as a place to return to whenever the chain starts moving faster than awareness can follow. There is a kind of freedom that does not look like freedom from the outside. The same things still happen, the same people, the same difficulties, the same body with its particular weather and its particular limits. None of that is removed. But something in the way it is met has quietly changed. What once felt like a verdict now feels like a condition. What once filled the entire field can now be seen as a movement passing through it. A feeling can be felt without becoming the place from which everything else is seen. The Buddha never promised a quieter world. He never taught that practice would make the difficulties stop arriving. What he pointed to was something inside the arriving itself, a way of meeting what appears without being completely taken over by it. And this does not live somewhere far from ordinary life. It does not wait for the right conditions or the right level of understanding. It lives in the next moment of contact, the next feeling that arises, the next fraction of a second between the feeling and the reaching for it. The place where everything is possible has always been there. Most people just never knew to look. If this way of meeting experience speaks to something you have been sitting with, leave a comment below. It helps to know you are not the only one carrying these questions. If this landed, or if it didn't, a like or dislike tells me whether to keep making videos like this. And if someone came to mind while you were watching, they may already know why. The story the mind tells about experience is not the enemy. It is simply a story, arising according to conditions, passing according to conditions. Like everything else in the field. What the Buddha pointed to was not the end of experience, not silence, not the disappearance of feeling or memory or the mind doing what minds do. It was something that becomes possible when experience is met, without the desperate need for it to be different than it is. The seeing does not have to be perfect. It does not have to arrive before the reaction does. It only has to arrive. And when it does, even late, even after the words have already been spoken, the chain is seen again. And in that seeing, it has already loosened its grip just slightly on the next moment. That is where the practice lives. Not in the having seen, in the seeing. Right here in this.